This TV series explores a variety of issues that relate to peace, social justice, and nonviolent social change. A few years ago, the state of Washington experienced a budget crisis, so the governor proposed drastic cuts and the legislature enacted drastic cuts. Then our state experienced another budget crisis, so the governor and the legislature slashed again. Revenue keeps falling short of the needs, so they keep slashing and slashing. They've cut funding for state employees, state parks, K-12 education, higher education, health care, assistance for our poorest people, and pretty much everything. But it's still not enough. A special legislative session from November 28 through much of December will propose more cuts, and then even more cuts are likely in January 2012 when the regular legislative session begins. The governor and the state legislature scrutinize everything on the expenditure side of the budget, but they have failed to seriously examine the revenue side, which is seriously dysfunctional. They don't seriously examine what are called tax expenditures, the various tax breaks, exemptions, and loopholes that amount to the same as if you were just giving money to those entities. Some of those tax expenditures have existed for decades without any meaningful oversight. And they've also refused to consider systemic changes in Washington State's tax system, which is the most regressive in the nation. Our state's richest people pay very low tax rates, and poor people pay very high tax rates. This month's TV program will explore all of this, and we have three top-notch, very well-informed guests to help us figure all this out. Jim Dawson is the campaign director for Fuse Washington, a statewide nonprofit organization that works on taxation and other public policy issues. Brendan Williams is a former state representative from the 22nd Legislative District. He earned a great reputation for boldly analyzing and critiquing our state's fiscal problems and for speaking and acting boldly to solve those problems. Chris Reckdahl is a current state representative from the 22nd Legislative District. He likewise is vigorously representing the public's interest in promoting social and economic justice in various ways, including working to reform our state's tax system. So welcome to all three of you. I'm glad you're here.
Thank you.
We want to start by looking at this widening gap between the rich and the poor. We've been hearing with the Occupy movement across the country the difference between the 1% and the 99%, and those realities happen here at the state level as well. Since the mid-1970s, the gap between the rich and everyone else has been growing much wider. This is true of people's income and people's net worth, their wealth. And so, Jim, I wonder, can you tell us something about what's been happening these last few decades, and maybe a comparison back to the 20s before the Great Depression?
Yeah, so really where we're at now, Glenn, is that income inequality is at its highest level since the Gilded Age, so the 1920s, where the rich have more wealth than they've ever had since that time. And so this is really devastating, both because the recession that we're in right now is because of the reckless gambling of Wall Street, and that's why we're having these budget deficits. And those are the folks who've benefited by far the most from the economic growth of the last 30 or 40 years.
And you have a graph that shows that peak of share of
wealth, yeah. So the graph shows basically the percentage of wealth of the top 10% over time, and it shows how it peaked in the 1920s, and then when we started to implement a lot of progressive taxes as well as social programs, we see the gap between the richest and the poorest go down substantially. And then once Reaganomics came in the 1980s, we're seeing that trend goes back up again, and that's what the graph shows, and now it's at its highest level since the 1920s.
And that's tax breaks for the rich and deregulation and other things that help the rich at the expense of everybody else.
Yeah, so the other slide shows that this is not at all an accident. It's not just because these top 1% are just doing better in the economy on their own accord. It's from conscious policy choices that were made primarily at the federal level. And so the other slide that we have shows how the tax levels for the richest 1% and actually the top 400 families have gone down dramatically in the last 30 or 40 years. So the point here is that this isn't an accident.
Right. Yeah, that was deliberate policy that did that. And when those folks don't pay, then either the rest of us pick up the slack, or else stuff gets cut.
Exactly.
Stuff that we don't want to cut.
Right.
But apparently they do. Chris, I wonder if you could give us an overview of this tax system in Washington State, the basic main sources of revenue.
Yeah, so Washington State really designed its tax code at statehood and with some changes along the way. So it's really a 19th century tax code that relies heavily on consumption. So our three big taxes in our state are sales tax, by far the largest. We're familiar with this. It's a 6.5% rate at the state level, and then there are local options on top of that. So in our region, it's 8.5 to 9%.
Gets close to 9%.
Gets close to 10 or slightly over in King County, depending on the local jurisdictions. We also have a B&O tax in our state, a business and occupation tax. We talk a lot about this around our community. This is really the same thing. It's the same transaction, but the sales tax is theoretically paid by the consumer, and the B&O tax is paid by the business on gross receipts. It's an unusual tax in that it doesn't take into account profit. It simply taxes a transaction. So small businesses who do not have high margins tend to pay a significantly higher percentage of their significantly higher tax percentage than the very largest companies who get to shelter a lot of things, obviously. Our third source in our state is property tax, which has gone through a lot of change through initiative process. We do not grow it very quickly. It is capped actually by initiative. It's the smallest of the three. But basically, those are what we've had essentially as the core in our state for a very long time. And as Jim has indicated, that's a fairly rational system 150 years ago when income inequality was not nearly as prevalent as it is today. States around the union pick different things to tax in order to fund core and vital services. We chose consumption taxes, and I know we'll get into this later, but little did we know this giant wealth gap would occur, and we would find eventually that these consumption taxes just really hit low-income and middle-class families significantly more than the wealthy.
Yeah. And we're also one of very few states that don't have any income tax, and that further skews things. Brendan, I wonder if you could tell us something about the notion of a progressive tax system or a regressive. And Washington's tax system, of course, has been criticized as being extremely regressive. Tell us about those concepts of progressive versus regressive.
Well, I think when you have Bill and Melinda Gates, who would be among those who would be willing to criticize this fact, paying the same sales tax and buying items for their children that a poor single mother might be paying in buying items for her family, clearly you can see that that is regressive. There's nothing progressive about that. The richest person is paying the same proportion of sale in a sales tax as the poorest person in our state is. And as consumption has declined, we're seeing, and in a sense, perhaps it should have declined. People were, in a sense, buying too many things and obviously overloading their credit cards. And that too has occurred at the federal level, arguably, on the national credit card, if you will. But the problem is, since consumption isn't keeping pace now, we're leaving it to consumers out there to somehow fund this state budget, and it's just simply not working out.
And so, go ahead.
I was just going to say the other part that makes it regressive is not that it's just that everyone is taxed that same percentage. It's that poor people spend all of their money meeting their basic needs, whereas there's a huge portion of the income of wealthy people who aren't buying anything in the state with that money. They're investing it elsewhere, et cetera, and none of that is captured, and that's why the wealthiest 20% or 10% of the state pay almost 6 times less than the bottom 20% as a percentage of their income, and that's why we have the most regressive system.
So the poor people pay effectively at a much higher rate than the rich people do, which seems backwards.
Yeah, 18% to 3%. It is completely upside down.
And you have a graph illustrating this?
There's a graph that does illustrate how regressive our tax system is very well.
Is there anything else you want to mention about the progressive versus regressive?
Well, as you mentioned earlier, Glenn, other states get around this by taxing income, and they play with their rates to ensure some level of fairness. when you tax income, you can appropriately and fairly tax people through the income stratification. This obsession we've had for so long with consumption in light of the changing economy that we've had just renders us without the tools necessary to make this system more fair. You pile on that citizen initiative, not the least of which Initiative 1053 last year. It did more than require a 2/3 tax, a vote of the legislature to raise tax. It actually locked in this dysfunctional and regressive structure really with permanency. And I think that's probably one of the more damaging issues here, is that if we wanted to get to this change, this fairer tax code, which I hear from everyone, from business owners to low-income individuals, we've made that very, very difficult in our state now.
Yeah, and what I hope that we'll be able to do with this program here is give people some better tools for thinking about these instead of just the simplistic sound bites that so often carry too much weight.
Right.
And my other comment just about progressivity is the idea that the people who benefit the most from the economy and the investments that our government makes are the ones who should be paying the most. And that's the concept of progressivity.
That's the point that I keep making. Some people have gotten fabulously wealthy from our political and economic system, and they have the greatest moral responsibility to pay for the system that made them rich. And the people who are getting squeezed out at the bottom should be paying less because the system has not been serving them well. It's just a matter of fairness. So, Chris, how did we get into this current fiscal mess? I know when we talked on the phone to prepare for this, you had some insights about how things have changed, things that have happened in our economy in the last couple of decades and the implications for taxes. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so if you go back to the origin of the tax code, again, when we had this more fair distribution of income and you were taxing consumption in the form of sales tax and business and occupation tax, you probably could have sustained that had everyone's income grown proportionally over time. But we've done a couple of things. Obviously, we've concentrated wealth in the hands of very few, and Jim has mentioned quite a bit of that. In Washington, not unlike other states, we've also moved our whole economy fundamentally from buying goods, things that are taxed, to buying services, which in our state come with a significantly lower tax. We charge a B&O on those, but we do not have a sales tax on a lot of services. And candidly, we exempt almost $4 billion worth of possible taxation in our state by not putting a sales tax on services. So the economy shift from goods purchasing to service purchasing. In the last 20 years, this explosion of growth from face-to-face purchasing, which is traditionally taxed the way we always have, to web-based sales. We have corporations across the United States, not the least of which is Amazon, actively working state by state to avoid taxation of web sales. We're sort of finally turning that around. And then finally, we do some growing activities in our state, specifically gaming, where we go to facilities, tribal facilities as a small example, where they also are not taxed. Now, all of those activities generate economic activity, and they're very good. But specifically, when you think about funding core services, early learning, K-12, higher ed, vulnerable citizens, the things our citizens expect state government to pay for, those require a certain kind of economy, and we have moved for 100 years in a very different direction, but we've clung to a tax code that simply doesn't reflect how the economy works and how we purchase nowadays.
There's some changes on a per capita basis that...
Well, evidence of sort of how dramatic this has gotten is we look at statistics in a couple of ways, and economists spend a lot of time with this question of, are you overtaxed or are you undertaxed? And if everyone just looks at how much they pay from one year to another, it's a little unfair because movie prices go up. Well, we don't abandon movies because they raise the price. It's really a function of your ability to pay. And a couple of metrics in our state, we look at, how big is our state and local governments combined as a share of overall economic activity? This number's been 10.5%, 11% for decades, and it actually had a peak of about 12%. We're going to be at what looks like a rapid descent to somewhere around 9% of state and local government activity as a share of the overall economy. This is unprecedented. Typically in dark recessions, you want your government to make up for the lack of private sector activity. And then as the economy recovers, you want your public sector to sink a little bit and your private activity to grow. This is really the first recession in our state and our nation's history where we somehow believe that as the private sector was falling, we should disproportionately hammer the public sector. And that's a very unusual activity.
You have a graph that illustrates something
Yeah,
this?
so the graph, what it shows is just state government as a share of economy and how of the overall economy, and how it's declined from about 7% down to below 5. And so we're at one of our lowest levels in over 40 years. And so we really do have a structural revenue problem where we're not able to pay for the basic things that allow our state to prosper, which is to maintain our quality of life through good public health and public safety and good amenities like public parks. We can't pay for a good education system like we need to in order to attract good paying jobs. And so these are things that are essential, and that's what 80% of our state budget is.
Yeah, and that's not what people are hearing through the glib sound bites that people are putting out there, and that we're kind of on our way to becoming a Mississippi of the North, is how I think about this, because they're cutting things that we never would have cut before.
Right.
I've been paying attention to this stuff since, pretty close attention, since the early 70s, and public assistance grants used to be, some percentage of, the state used to calculate a basic standard of need was the term they had.
Sure.
And public assistance grants were some percentage of that. And the grants, like for AFDC, which is now TANF, those grants kept dropping way below, now below half.
Sure.
And other things, GAU, which then became Disability Lifeline, which is getting
Hammered. Or eliminated, depending on who you ask.
Depending on,
right.
It's been pummeled and hammered, and now it might be eliminated.
It's amazing.
Right.
And that's for people who have medical reasons why they are unemployable, and in many cases they're applying for SSI disability, and those cases are pending, and they're getting squeezed down to under $200 a month or zero, depending on which, what actually happens here. But it's appalling.
And the cruelty of it is that welfare reform was supposed to replace the concept of a handout with a hand up. That was at least the rhetoric of the time. And now we're seeing those forms of assistance being squeezed to where you're not even providing that hand up to folks to get back up on their feet.
Yeah, they're cutting things like childcare, so people can't afford to lower income people at a working class level can't even afford to keep their jobs.
Sure.
Because if you lose childcare benefits, then to pay for that on the open market is too expensive.
Adjusted for inflation, our per capita spending in the state, our state government spending on its individuals through education and these vital programs that we've talked about, we are at what we believe is about a 25-year low. And throughout this entire fiscal crisis, aggregate income has grown, aggregate GDP, business activity in the state has grown. We've only had 1 year in this entire cycle here where we've actually seen aggregate personal income in the state of Washington shrink. We clearly see in the data that the wealthy are getting wealthier.
Sure.
We are cutting vital programs to the most vulnerable folks, and this is sort of the recipe for how you sustain long-term unemployment instead of putting a floor under people to get them active and get them back into the economy.
You think of that thing about, you put a frog in water, and if you put the frog in boiling water, it'll jump out. But if you put it in water, then turn the heat up, it'll slowly cook the frog.
Sure.
Because the frog won't notice the little incremental change in the temperature. And we keep doing this with our state. It's like tightening it down, tightening it down, tightening it down. It's every session, of the legislature, people say, oh, this is going to be the worst one ever because we have to make painful cuts. Then they come back a year later and say, oh, this is going to be the worst one ever. We have to make these painful cuts. And it's just getting worse and worse. And it's like that frog in the water.
You're absolutely correct. I mean, if Chris was going into a special session now where he needed to cut, he and his colleagues, $12 billion from the state, which is what will have been cut over a period of time, all at once, the public would be outraged. They would be screaming. There would be a clamor. But because this has occurred over a period of time, it's not gone as noticed as it should be.
Right, and it becomes sort of the new normal. It's like people have been acclimated to this notion that the government just needs to be abandoning more and more people.
Right.
Well, I would say the hopeful part is I think there is an outrage, and I think that's the Occupy Wall Street movement, and we're seeing people come out and voice their concerns and coming out opposed to these things.
Yeah, it's been interesting. I've seen, we're taping this program now in mid-November, and regardless of whether people hold the ground that they have held as an Occupy thing, the public opinion of the movement the polls have been saying it's about 45% support, whereas Congress is at 9% approval rating. So,
You know, I would just add to Jim's point, there is hope here. There's a huge opportunity. When you think of the economy of the United States, albeit more challenged because of growth in China and around the world, we are still a growing economy. There's still aggregate income gains. There is still business activity that's on a growing scale. Certainly more competitive. We have to keep a razor-sharp focus on our education system. But we have wealth, and we have growing income, and we have the ability to make life a standard of life for more Americans and more Washingtonians move proportionally. What we have, as he's indicated, is a public policy failure to recognize a sort of a moral and social obligation to at least take care of the basic needs of folks. And we really want people to work hard, and you want that competition. And no one is saying there should be a guaranteed outcome, but there should be a guaranteed equality of opportunity. That's what America's lost. And through good tax codes and through good public policy, you can have that opportunity for people. And we certainly live in a country where there's huge opportunity still.
Right. But that income growth, that economic growth has all been at the very top end. And working class people, middle class people, poor people are subsidizing the folks who are extremely rich. And that strikes me as just morally wrong. And not sustainable. At some point, you're going to
ultimately,
crash the thing.
it's bad for our economy. You don't have people to buy stuff, then.
Right.
Right.
And if people can't get a decent education, then they're going to be looking to other countries for people to be the scientists, the engineers, the whatever. You know.
Right.
You've done a lot of work about how we fund long-term care for people, and on the one hand, folks will think, "Oh yeah, stick it to those guys."
Right.
But what happens when a nursing home or a doctor or other healthcare providers don't get reimbursed adequately for when they're caring for people who are elderly or people with disabilities? Tell us something about that aspect of it.
Well, we're an aging society, and we haven't really come to grips with that. Washington's had a model long-term care system in developing community-based options for folks, and that's been great. One of the sad ironies of the fact that we are a comparatively wealthy state is that the federal government, in effect, punishes us when it comes to Medicaid reimbursement, which pays for care for those who are medically indigent, commonly those persons in nursing homes or in-home care, other settings. And so we get the nation's lowest matching rate, we and some other states, from the feds. And the problem is that the other states have the ability to offset that because they actually have income taxes. We don't. And so even though we're being punished for having a higher income by the federal government, we have no means of making that up when it comes to our own Medicaid contribution. And so Chris and his colleagues are faced with these very unpleasant choices, including the governor's proposed reduction in eligibility for long-term care services for as many as 5,000 Washingtonians. We've seen a caregiver training initiative that's been suspended, reinstated by the voters recently.
Yeah, the voters had good sense in early November to vote for the better standards of training and supports for the people who are doing the caregiving.
Right.
So the public is with us on wanting quality of care.
Well, the public wants a lot of things. The question is, are they going to be willing to pay for these things? And so that's always going to be the test. But I think clearly the public has now sent a signal that long-term care, the needs of an aging society are important to them. And they really made that decision not based on some slick advertising campaign like we saw in the liquor initiative, but rather just based on the morality of the ballot title in the case of 1163. They said, yes, we should have a well-trained long-term caregiving workforce that is also subject to criminal background checks. And that is something we as a society are willing to pay for.
Yeah, we have to exercise some wisdom and some good judgment in paying for things that we really need. I can imagine somebody wanting to save money by never changing the oil in their car. And you can save money for a little while. Eventually it's going to cost you a whole lot more when you have to replace the engine.
Well,
so we need to think at some of these things that are expenditures are really investments in future health, education, all kinds of quality of life items.
And the state has been forced then to come up with new policies. For example, a judge just suspended the state's effort to cut back on Medicaid reimbursement for hospital visits. We were going to be the first state in the nation to do this, really limit that reimbursement. And there are those instances where you don't want to be first because there's a reason why you're first.
Yeah.
You know, no other state would have even thought of this idea because what's going to happen is the hospitals are not able to turn anyone away from their doors under federal law.
Right.
It's just going to become uncompensated care. And we're already seeing perhaps as much as $1 billion in uncompensated care within the state of Washington. And so you're just adding to the misery of everybody else, you know, these providers, those of us who have insurance, we're going to be paying higher premiums. So somebody's going to be paying
Right.
for this at the end of the
Yeah,
day.
it's cost shifting in all kinds of ways. If we don't solve the problems, the revenue side of the problems, what further cuts are people talking about? And realizing we're taping the program now in mid-November, the program will air throughout December, but there's another legislative session coming around in January.
Well, you know, it's been well documented that when you take another $2 billion out of a budget cycle that's only got 18 months left, and you've got constitutional protections around a significant amount of this, you know, you're looking at average 25 and 30% cuts to some of the services that could still be eligible for reduction. You know, a lot of folks say to me, "Hey, thank goodness K-12 is protected." Well, people have to be careful of that. There are clear protections in K-12 about basic education. But things like levy equalization, which legislators around the state fall on their sword for, that is not protected. All-day kindergarten
that's
is
the
not
concept
protected.
that richer districts can afford to pass levies and poor districts can't.
That's right. So
And-
the
and
state
the
has
state
always
needs to
equalized that.
balance that out,
Yeah. So there's a lot at risk. Tons of activities in the human services world. You know, we've done what we can, as you indicated, to protect Disability Lifeline and basic health for some. All of that is at risk if this is an all-cuts approach. And as folks have indicated already, you know, we've already taken essentially a 90 to 95% cuts approach to this and filled up maybe 5 to 10% of this deficit over the last couple of years with fees, but we haven't yet touched the tax fairness question or the new revenue question.
You wrote in an article that you wrote for the Seattle Times that we cannot cut our way to prosperity, which I think is a great line.
It's never been done before.
Yeah.
You can't cut your way back to prosperity. Economists like John Maynard Keynes, you know, had recognized that fact, and for a long time, that sort of economic philosophy was the gospel to both Democrats and Republicans alike. The idea that in times of fiscal crisis, when the economy is on the ropes, the federal government, as a payer of last resort, is actually priming the pump of the economy. Yeah. And we have not been doing that. We've shifted away from that. A lot of the Tea Party anger and such has shifted us away from the right solutions. And then, of course, as Chris alluded to, Initiative 1053 has made it harder then for the legislature to unilaterally come up with the tax decisions that are necessary in order to keep our economy going. And so, you know, you look at a circumstance like my son, who's going to start the 4th grade next year, would have 2 more kids in his class under the proposal that the governors had to make to the legislature, or the Monarch Children's Center that deals with children who have been sexually abused in Lacey might face closure because it's part of the child welfare cuts that would occur under the budget proposal that the governors had to make. So we can't keep going this direction and still be a moral and just society.
Yeah. So let me just add, a lot of people sit back and they say, well, 2 kids, that doesn't sound like much. And let's not even look at it from the teacher perspective. Let's look at it from our sons and daughters. 2 more kids in the average elementary classroom is roughly an 8 to 10% workload increase for a teacher. And if they spread their time out proportionately, that's 8 to 10% less contact time for every kid in that class. And everything we know about early learning and early grade learning is about reading, it's about basic fundamental skill building, it's about contact time with teachers who need to put some intensity on those who need the most learning. You talked earlier about these trade-offs. 2 kids sounds so innocent, but when you pull 8 to 10% contact time away from our kids, we will pay for that dearly down the road when they don't make progress. Our correctional system in America is evidence of a lack of education funding. Our acute care system is evidence of a lack of preventative care systems. We do have these trade-offs. It's empirical now. We can see it. This is a disaster when you raise class sizes like this.
Yeah, there's been a really excellent research done on this by economists and others who've really studied this, and it's powerfully proved, just what you're saying. And Jim, you've got a figure that says that we've lost 644,000 public sector jobs in the last few years.
So, yeah, basically, at a time when we need government to respond to meet the basic needs of the population, instead of maintaining jobs, we're losing them. Almost 2/3 of a million jobs have been lost nationally in local and state governments. And so it's the exact wrong way that we want to go. And the reason to think about kind of this historical context is, so in almost every past recession, the reason why governments increase taxes at those times is because if you look at what happens, it's not that there's not money in the economy, it's that people are uncertain about spending. And so if you look at here in our state, we have Microsoft sitting on over $55 billion in reserves right now. It's not that they don't have money, it's that they don't have the certainty to spend. And so at a time when there is uncertainty, one, it's the best time to make public investments because that's when it's cheapest. And then two, it helps to spur the economy back, and you do that by targeted tax increases.
Yeah, there have been some public construction projects where the bids have come in way under what the estimate was. Right. And so the school district or the whatever the local jurisdiction is found, wow, this was the right time to do that thing because the contractors are hungry and they could bid low and the public got a good deal on it. And the other end of this is if those 644,000 public employees who've lost their jobs, they're not going to be going out and buying a new car. They're not going to be going out to restaurants like they did. They're not going to be buying furniture. They're not going to be spending money, and it creates a downward spiral in the whole economy when it should be the opposite policy. We should be priming the pump, creating jobs so that people will get out and have some discretionary income that they can spend. And these layoffs, these cutbacks, are just digging us deeper and deeper in a hole. It's a downward spiral. There's no end to it. Right. And especially for a state like ours that's so dependent on sales tax and B&O tax, that's what gets hurt because when people lay off a bunch of state employees or teachers or whatever, and they don't have money to spend, so there's less sales tax and less B&O tax coming in, and then the legislature has to cut further. And it's like, we've got to reverse that. Right. And that's, so we'll get into that as the program progresses. One of the interesting concepts is this concept of tax expenditure that I mentioned when I was introducing this topic. Every budget has the expenditure side, and there's a revenue side, and the expenditure side gets a lot of scrutiny from the executive and the legislative branches, but the revenue side just gets less scrutiny. And when a government gives somebody a tax break, the net effect is the same as if we just gave them a bunch of money. So if we have a tax break for elective cosmetic surgery, for example, which we have in the state, it's like taxing all of us using some of our money to subsidize people who do that. And it's like, well, is that a good use of our resources? So could you tell us something about the concept of tax expenditures, Chris, and maybe some examples and some of the problems with these?
Yeah, so Washington's not unusual in this. There's been a multiple decade opportunity for special interests to come to legislators and say, listen, I believe my industry or my business or my nonprofit even would be better off if I had a tax break. This is classic logic of trickle down, where if you give me a break, I assure you it'll create jobs, it'll trickle through the economy, and we'll build this thing up. Obviously, we've learned a lot about supply-side economics. It is essentially a great failure around the nation and in this state. And so a lot of folks say to me, these are loopholes, and I am very intentional to say they're not loopholes. Loopholes are tricky things that accountants find that legislators didn't exactly intend. Everything we have on the books in Washington was fully intended by some legislature at some time to give a break. Some of it well-intentioned. Virtually none of it has accountability in terms of requiring certain outcomes like job growth, family wage job growth, certain levels of employment. These were things given away often during good times, but even during crisis, in hopes that they would produce something, and we really have very little track record. So a couple of examples, just a couple of big numbers really. It's shocking to people to realize we have a $32 billion biennium general fund budget in the state of Washington. We actually don't collect another $52 billion in taxes. We collect only 40% of what we would if everything was being taxed at the rates that we have. Now, some of that's a little deceiving, and you always have to be very honest about this. The federal government doesn't allow you to tax interstate commerce, for example. So if you're being very true to the economics and the policy here, a whole bunch of stuff would not be taxed. When you boil down the state's nearly 600 tax exemptions that we have on the books today, the legislature has total and complete control of about $11 or $12 billion that we do not collect. That's 25% of the budget we would otherwise have if we had not given these things out. And they're everything from what we talked about earlier, not taxing services, not taxing cosmetic surgery. We do not tax Wall Street banks when they make profit selling loans to customers. We have huge corporations in Washington, some that are so successful and we want them to be, who earn additional income through the investment of their profits, just like you and I would. We don't tax that income. If you and I invest that stuff, we pay a federal capital gains tax, and they might pay something to the feds. They pay nothing to the state of Washington on that secondary income. So it's not hard to imagine how they came into being. It's just that they have become such an enormous part of this challenge. This is why Jim and I and Brendan talk, regularly about this idea that we used to tax like 65 to 70% of all transactions would yield something for your schools and your vulnerable citizens through a tax code. And now less than 40% of the transactions are actually taxable. This is the recipe for really deteriorating what we call our public structures, these valuable things we put in place to protect people and fund our education system.
And I would just add, of those almost 600 tax breaks, only 17% have ever even been reviewed. And so here we have a system where we're scrutinizing every penny that we send to our kids, every penny that we spend on health care. It gets audited over and over again and looked at every single legislative session. And once a tax break is passed, most of them are never reviewed again. And so it is really an inequality, and it makes no sense. And we can no longer afford it as a state. I think that's clear.
Yeah, I read a recent report that was looking at some of these and said that they could not discern what the public policy intention was.
Right.
You can sort of guess somebody wanted to get a break.
Sure.
But as far as how does this help the state? Well, nobody really knows, and it's never been documented. There's no accounting for it, and there's no meaningful oversight. We need to have sunset laws. So that we'll do this tax break or some tax expenditure, and after 6 years it expires, and it has to get renewed if you're going to persist. Otherwise, it goes away.
Right.
Or something like all kinds of things.
They all need a sunset. They all need a review period. They all need to have very clear objectives built into this authorizing statute. We need a systemic process for reviewing these things aggressively, and as Jim indicated, it's going to take us 15 to 20 years to get through them all. We're going to suffer through about 4 or 5 more recessions if you just follow history before that occurs, so we can't wait that long. And candidly, we probably can't leave this up to the legislature. These folks are under the kind of pressure that put them in place. They don't have the same incentive to remove them, and quite frankly, due to Initiative 1053, most citizens didn't realize that it now takes a 2/3 requirement even to remove or amend a tax break for a large corporation because it's deemed a tax increase. So there's a lot we can do to solve this.
And the state auditor could have a role in this. There's all kinds of stuff. And one of you had mentioned when we were preparing for the program about some accountability. Well, also in some background reading I was doing. So if some business says, oh yeah, give us this tax break and we'll create a bunch of jobs, there should be some way of measuring, all right, how many jobs did you create?
Sure.
Were they family level jobs with benefits and so forth, or was it like minimum wage where we end up subsidizing your business through Medicaid and food stamps?
Or did they create none at all and actually ship jobs out of the state?
Right, and some of them
and they
doing
may
that
still
too.
be getting their tax break.
Right.
So we hold single moms who are low income, we hold them more accountable than we do Microsoft or Boeing.
Right. There's all kinds of accountability. We want to hold drunk drivers accountable, single moms accountable. You want to hold school teachers accountable. Everybody's clamping down on accountability for everybody except for the richest people and the richest corporations,
Mm-hmm.
and it's just not fair.
Yeah.
So, quick mention, the Microsofts and Boeings, we mention them a lot because they're very recognizable corporate names. We want these companies to be successful. We want them in Washington. We're glad they're here. They have really good family-paying jobs for the most part. The question we have to sort of grapple with as public policymakers and as activists in the community is, what is the trade-off? So these folks are now telling us how desperate they are for a trained and skilled workforce. And so one of the policy questions we've sort of posed as legislators to them is that trade-off gotten so significant that you're willing to close down some of these tax privileges that you have, which clearly they don't need with record-breaking profits? And could we take some of that resource and put it into our training system and help you in a way that is very tangible and improves the lives of individuals, as opposed to giving you this break and taking the risk that that money goes to China for production or Europe for production? It's a far better thing for our citizens to invest in the things that they need as a company rather than give them a direct break.
Right.
Yeah. So there's all these kinds of things where you got to just like be thinking and alert. The stuff has to be transparent, so that the public and the legislators know what's going on and the stuff gets talked about. Otherwise, it's hidden away. They get enacted and then nobody ever checks them out again. So we need to have a more vigorous democracy in this area as well as in so many other areas.
It would be really helpful if we asked the state's newspapers to let go of a $42 million a biennium break that they get for simply selling newspapers. If you buy a Newsweek, you pay sales tax, but if you buy the Seattle Times, you don't pay a sales tax. That is a benefit to them very specifically that they may or may not need, but it's hard to get them to engage in this question of tax preferences and tax expenditures and loopholes, if you will, because they are at the trough. And so we've got to have programs like yours and others that put some light on this subject, because we can't get the mainstream media to put attention on it when they're the benefactors.
Yeah, well, they're very defensive about things in their interest. Some of them are very vigorous in promoting transparency of public's right to know, because that's their agenda.
Right.
But what about the public's right to have them carry their fair share of the revenue structure? No. So,
Yeah, right.
So,
Right.
so let's all be open and fair about this. What would you like to see in the way of short-term solutions, and then we'll talk about long-term solutions, because we need to figure out what to do right now for short-term, and then some of the things that we're talking about are actually longer-term, but there may be some things on the short-term that we could do. What would any of you recommend?
There are a lot of things that can be done in the short term. One, with a simple majority vote, the legislature can make sure that fees that are charged are adequate to cover the cost of enforcement. So for example, if you go to apply for a water permit, the state is subsidizing the application process. Or for a forest permit.
The water permit is like to use
water, large amounts
to
of the
draw.
public's water.
Yeah.
Right now, they're not paying for even the cost of administering the permit.
Okay.
So this is somewhere where we should make people who benefit from the services pay the proper fee, right?
Okay.
And then so that's one thing that they could do. Perhaps the most important one in my book is increasing the fee on toxic chemicals and oil in the state. That could raise a large amount of money. It hasn't changed in over 20 years. It's a flat fee. It's not even a percentage. And so this is something that we could raise a large amount of money with and help to fund the programs that are on the chopping block, which are a lot of environmental programs.
Right. So it's kind of more of a pay-as-you-go thing.
Sure.
Right.
Because there are costs that the public is paying.
Right.
And these folks who are benefiting from
We're
that
subsidizing big oil, big ag, the
Right.
big timber
Yeah.
companies.
Yeah.
They're not even paying their, the cost of administering the
Right.
permits.
Okay.
So that's one thing, fees, and that can be done with a simple majority in the legislature. The second thing is there are a lot of short-term revenue options that we can look at in order to raise money that we need to prevent these devastating cuts that are being proposed. So things like ending the tax break on Wall Street banks, ending the tax break on elective cosmetic surgery, and making things like if you buy software out of a box, you pay a sales tax, but if you buy customized software, you don't pay a sales tax. that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. That we should create parity in the marketplace, and those kinds of things raise money.
And that would be regressive too, because it's an ordinary middle class or working class person who buys some software out of the box, but it's somebody who's in a higher bracket who can have some software custom designed for you.
And that'll get us part of the way there. And then I would say that I think that the governor needs to come out, just like she says, sorry, we can't afford basic services anymore. She should be telling the business community, sorry, we can't afford your tax breaks anymore. So either you can agree to end your tax breaks, we're either going to end your tax breaks, or we're going to increase certain tax rates on certain businesses, because that is a responsible way to go. Our tax break budget has grown by over $1 billion in the last 10 or 15 years. So they need to make up the difference. And that can either be, we'll end some of those tax breaks that aren't performing, or if they're really wed to those tax breaks, then we can make an increase on some service businesses and other things like that, and that can help raise some money. And then I think because we do have a regressive system, most of our options are somewhat regressive. And so there's a lot of talk about whether or not a sales tax increase should happen or not. We may need to go there in order to prevent these service cuts from happening. That would be the most regressive thing that we can do. Leaving seniors at home without in-home care to be turned is by far more regressive than a sales tax increase. But the way that we can make that sales tax increase, if it occurs, less regressive and actually give a tax break to the lowest income populations is by fully funding the working family's tax rebate, which is a mechanism that's been around for a long time. It's been on the books, but it has never been funded. And so if we fund that rebate, that would actually reduce the amount that the lowest income families and actually middle class working families are paying.
Oh, wow. Let's talk about some longer term solutions. Something's going to take a few years either to muster the public will or to devise the technical aspects of the program. What longer term solutions would any of you recommend?
Well, so the best solutions are the ones that take the longest to implement. And so a great option is a capital gains tax, an excise tax on capital gains, which is basically if you sell stocks or your vacation home, those types of things, it doesn't apply, it wouldn't apply to like selling your own personal home. All the same federal guidelines would apply. Well, this is where a lot of wealth growth happens at the top 1% is in capital gains, and it's actually the lowest tax form of income and gain, both at the federal level, and it's not taxed at all here in Washington State. So we could put an excise tax in place on capital gains that could raise over $500 million a year. The problem is it would take a couple years to actually put it in place. So we wouldn't be able to raise that money in the short term to solve this budget gap that we have right now, but that would be a great long-term way to raise the revenue that we need to have the quality schools and education that we need.
And if we can come up with some of these different kinds of taxes, we're not putting all of our eggs in the sales tax and property tax and B&O baskets. The more you can diversify the sources, the more stable you'll have. It's like a
diverse portfolio.
You're protected. Pardon me?
A diverse portfolio.
Yeah,
so this is
it's that concept.
This is where I think Democrats and Republicans, if we would start with an interest-based approach and not defend some turf, where we could come together and say, hey, let's imagine we wrote this tax code today in the way that we understand the economy works. What we would agree to is that you could lower rates just about across the board. You could almost lower sales tax rates, B&O rates, or get rid of it possibly, lower property tax rates, but ensure that it's applied broadly through the economy, no longer have these large exemptions out there that are really distorting the market and creating inequities in the system. You could generate more a positive income for the state to fund our core services. You'd have lower overall rates, and essentially you would have a tax code that mirrors the way we now behave in the economy. You would do things specifically in that, like taxing income instead of just consumption. You would tax corporate profit instead of just gross sales. So not only do you get a more adequate system that moves with the economy, you get a fairer tax code in the process. These are all things we would do as Democrats and Republicans if we sat down today and said, let's have the courage to rewrite this tax code. The days of incrementalism are probably over if you want real meaningful change, but the power and the inertia of the political process keeps us moving in these increments.
Right.
But you ask long-term solutions, that's it. Put people in a room, not very many of us, to redraw this thing and actually design it around a contemporary economy.
I was just appalled to hear the governor say that it's okay to cut human services and expect that churches and charities will pick up the slack. I mean, how cruel is that to cut for people who are in need and then dump the burden on somebody else who's a voluntary organization like a religious congregation or a charity? Why not say the people who are the most vulnerable, kids, sick people, the elderly, whatever, the hungry, the homeless, they get their needs met.
Right.
And then if an oil company wants to get a tax break, you don't get a tax break anymore. If an oil company wants more money, they can go out and take up a collection and stand there with a cup, say, I'm an oil company, do you want to donate something?
Yeah.
Let the rich people, let the big corporations do the charity thing,
Right.
If they want it. But it should be part of the social contract that we take care of people who are hurting. I just can't imagine somebody with such a cruel and insensitive thing as to cut the vulnerable people and dump that onto the churches
Right.
and charities.
Yeah, they're already overburdened.
Yeah, so
Well,
another
and
key structural change long-term here is I think you actually have to restore the republic. I mean, you have to restore the constitutional democracy that the citizens in this state put forward by empowering legislators within limits. But rather than doing it, sort of death by initiative, one idea at a time, limit this tax, cap this, I think the legislature should have the levers to make some tough decisions. And if appropriate, say to the legislature, we know that in tough times, government should grow as a share of the economy, and during good times, we would expect you to shrink. We should put a band around the size of the state government, give it enough width in that band to actually move with the economy and act as a policy lever to fix things. But we would be well served to give the flexibility back, regardless of who's in the majority, Democrats or Republicans. They need tools to respond. Those have been taken away. So that's one of those long-term solutions that I think it's going to be tough for citizens to come to grips with because they imagine that they have great control over this tax code through initiative, when in fact all they've really done is serve a single initiative writer whose business interest also mirrors that of our large corporations, and we've essentially just frozen the tax code to the disadvantage of the common citizen.
Yeah, it's really skewed those initiatives that have restricted taxes in those ways that put us in the box where a minority of people can run the budget instead of the majority. And it's just skewed the whole thing. It seems like if the ordinary people had the information, which they will after having watched this program, and reading some of the good stuff that's out there from several organizations, yours, I mean, there are a number of groups that are doing good stuff. If people could get informed, we could have a public process that would be giving some guidance to it and trust the wisdom of the grassroots to get informed. And I would hope that people would find ways, like the Economic Opportunity Institute is an independent, nonpartisan organization that's put out some good, thoughtful information. I want to put in a plug for Fuse Washington, the group that you work with. And we've got their phone number in Seattle, 206-420-0133, and the website is www.fusewashington.org. And you folks work on taxes and other public policy issues.
Yeah, so Fuse works on kind of whatever is most important in Washington State, and that we work on both issues and elections, and our goal is to get more people involved in politics and to also make it easy for folks, as we know that people are overwhelmed in their daily lives, and so we look for what the most important actions are that are needed at the time, and provide easy and accessible ways to get involved.
Yeah, I know you really support democracy in the kind of rich form that we need to implement what we're talking about here. What would any of you like to see viewers do as a way to help? Oh, I also want to put in a plug for information. The state legislative website is really good. They do a good job of pulling together current information on the various bills, and you can visit www.leg.wa.gov. They're really very good. Could we get like a brief thought of how you'd like to see people help?
Yeah, well, coming up, I don't know if it'll be on air by then, but on November 28th, this special session begins.
Yeah, this will air throughout December.
Oh, December, okay.
Yeah.
So different ways that people can get involved. One is to reach out and contact your legislators. They need to hear from you and about your positions on these issues. Either do that by making an appointment, meeting them with them in person. I know that when Brendan was a legislator and Chris meets with constituents on a regular basis. And so that's incredibly important. And the other part is getting involved in grassroots groups to help organize the community, right? Because it's great to share your voice, but also getting more people involved in the process is going to be really, really important.
Right, thanks. Yeah, and can we be pretty tight on the time?
Yeah, no, I think we're fortunate to live in a progressive community. I think it's important for people to reach out to family and friends around the state and let them know this is what we need to do here, because it's, there aren't enough Chris Reichdahls in the legislature. We need more people who are willing to have courage in order to do the right thing.
Yeah, Chris.
Controlled outrage. Let's be reasonable about this, but the great outrage around the world is bringing democracy and fairness. We've seen it all over the world. It can happen here very specifically. I don't care if you're a Democrat or Republican, you call yourself a conservative or a liberal. Everyone I talk to wants this tax code scrutinized. Not just the exemptions, but the B&O tax. There's a way to make business taxes fairer, personal taxes fairer. If everyone insisted on that through outreach to the legislature and through the organizations they're involved with, if everyone's demanding it, we're going to talk about it as a legislature.
Thanks. I want to thank Jim Dawson, Brendan Williams, and Chris Reichdahl. I want to thank all the folks who've been watching. A budget is a numerical way of expressing your values, what you really believe in. And we have to ask, what do our state and federal and local budgets say about our values? We need to make sure that we represent the most decent and humane values in how we spend our public money and in how we raise public money to fund the real needs. We can adjust the relative sizes of the slices of the budget pie, and we can also make the pie bigger. We have some folks who've gotten fabulously wealthy, and they should have the biggest responsibility, I believe, to pay for the systems that made them wealthy. For information about this issue, you can contact www.fusewashington.org and several other good organizations. For information about a variety of issues that relate to peace, social justice, and nonviolence, you can contact the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation at 360-491-9093 and www.olympiafor.org. In case you're watching this program on a Thursday night in December 2011, stay tuned for our documentary series, The Big Picture, which starts at 10 p.m. December's film is The Mean World Syndrome. Why are so many people afraid of things that they don't need to be afraid of? Partly it's because of violence in the media, especially in local news coverage. So check that out. We're all one human family and we all share one planet. We can create a better world, but we all have to work at it. And the world needs what you have to offer. Thanks. This TV series explores a variety of issues that relate to peace, social justice, and nonviolent social change. A few years ago, the state of Washington experienced a budget crisis, so the governor proposed drastic cuts and the legislature enacted drastic cuts. Then our state experienced another budget crisis, so the governor and the legislature slashed again. Revenue keeps falling short of the needs, so they keep slashing and slashing. They've cut funding for state employees, state parks, K-12 education, higher education, health care, assistance for our poorest people, and pretty much everything. But it's still not enough. A special legislative session from November 28 through much of December, will propose more cuts, and then even more cuts are likely in January 2012 when the regular legislative session begins. The governor and the state legislature scrutinize everything on the expenditure side of the budget, but they have failed to seriously examine and for speaking and acting boldly to solve those problems. Chris Reckdahl is a current state representative from the 22nd Legislative District. He likewise is vigorously representing the public's interest in promoting social and economic justice in various ways, including working to reform our state's tax system. So welcome to all three of you. I'm glad you're here.
Thank you.
We want to start by looking at this widening gap between the rich and the poor. We've been hearing with the Occupy movement across the country the difference between the 1% and the 99%, and those realities happen here at the state level as well. Since the mid-1970s, the gap between the rich and everyone else has been growing much wider. This is true of people's income and people's net worth, their wealth. And so, Jim, I wonder, can you tell us something about what's been happening these last few decades, and maybe a comparison back to the 20s before the Great Depression?
Yeah, so really where we're at now, Glenn, is that income inequality is at its highest level since the Gilded Age, so the 1920s, where the rich have more wealth than they've ever had since that time. And so this is really devastating, both because the recession that we're in right now is because of the reckless gambling of Wall Street, and that's why we're having these budget deficits. And those are the folks who've benefited by far the most from the economic growth of the last 30 or 40 years.
And you have a graph that shows that peak of share of
wealth, yeah. So the graph shows basically the percentage of wealth of the top 10% over time, and it shows how it peaked in the 1920s, and then when we started to implement a lot of progressive taxes as well as social programs, we see the gap between the richest and the poorest go down substantially. And then once Reaganomics came in the 1980s, we're seeing that trend goes back up again, and that's what the graph shows, and now it's at its highest level since the 1920s.
And that's tax breaks for the rich and deregulation and other things that help the rich at the expense of everybody else.
Yeah, so the other slide shows that this is not at all an accident. It's not just because
the revenue side, which is seriously dysfunctional. They don't seriously examine what are called tax expenditures, the various tax breaks, exemptions, and loopholes that amount to the same as if you were just giving money to those entities. Some of those tax expenditures have existed for decades without any meaningful oversight. And they've also refused to consider systemic changes in Washington State's tax system, which is the most regressive in the nation. Our state's richest people pay very low tax rates, and poor people pay very high tax rates. This month's TV program will explore all of this, and we have three top-notch, very well-informed guests to help us figure all this out. Jim Dawson is the campaign director for Fuse Washington, a statewide nonprofit organization that works on taxation and other public policy issues. Brendan Williams is a former state representative from the 22nd Legislative District. He earned a great reputation for boldly analyzing and critiquing our state's fiscal problems.